You'd think a bottle of whiskey would mean celebration, but on the battlefield, it meant someone was bleeding. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we step into the ragged tents and muddy ditches, where liquor wasn't for toasting, it was for sterilizing bayonets. Funny, isn't it, how the same drink that numbed pain could also clean a wound if it didn't knock you out first? A blood-streaked hand, a gurgled scream, and the sharp sting of grain alcohol poured into an open gash. Welcome to the Civil War's version of first aid, where antiseptics were whatever you could find, and training was mostly guesswork. What did they pack into bullet wounds when they ran out of bandages? Mud? Yes, mud. Because mud they thought cooled the inflammation and sealed the skin. It didn't. But in the chaos, it was something, maybe even hope in pace form. If your brain finds comfort in this kind of strange, sleepy contradiction, maybe give that like button a little nudge. And if the idea of whiskey as surgery prep has you blinking in the dark, subscribing might just be your next best mistake. Let me ask you something odd before we drift deeper. What's the weirdest historical remedy you've ever heard of? And do you think it worked? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late afternoon somewhere in Tennessee. The rain has passed, but the ground is still wet brown and clinging. You crouch beside a wounded man whose thigh has been split open by shrapnel. His face is pale, voice thin. There's no doctor. There's only you and the bottle of whiskey in your hand. First you take a swig, for courage, then another for the wound. The clear liquid hisses against raw flesh. He screams. You flinch. The wound bubbles not cleanly but fiercely like it's fighting back. There are no gloves, no gauze, just a piece of your own torn shirt pressed down hard. You whisper something, but even you don't know if it's for him or for yourself. Whiskey was considered precious cargo, not for celebration, but for survival. Soldiers learned to ration it not by the bottle, but by the drop. It could dull pain during an impromptu amputation. It could clean a rusted bayonet. It could, in theory, prevent infection, though whether it truly helped is still up for debate. Some scholars argue its antiseptic effect was overstated, while others suggest it was at least better than the alternative, doing nothing. And when whiskey ran out, mud stepped in. Not just any mud, cool, wet earth scooped and slapped into wounds like clay into a cracked pot. It sounds absurd, but it was driven by desperation. Folk wisdom held that mud could draw out the fever. In reality, it probably added more bacteria than it removed. Yet strangely, there were cases, rare ones, where soldiers survived these muddy treatments. Some historians wonder if certain clays had mild antibacterial properties. Others believe it was pure luck or the resilience of youth and adrenaline. In one account, a Confederate soldier stuffed his boot with creek mud to stop a foot injury from bleeding. By the time medics reached him, the wound was packed so tightly they had to soak it for hours to peel it away. He lost 3 toes but survived, earning the nickname Mudfoot for the rest of the war. It wasn't science. It wasn't strategy. It was survival improvised. The tent flap opens and you step into a world that smells of blood, smoke, and sweat. Lanterns cast flickering shadows across canvas walls, illuminating a wooden table slick with dark stains. There's no time for gentle introductions here. Someone is already screaming. It's an amputation tent, and the bone saws are in full chorus. You move closer, careful not to trip over the stacked crates of supplies, or what's left of them. Chloroform bottles rattle in a crate nearby, some already empty. A soldier lies flat arms, pinned by comrades, eyes wide, as a cloth soaked in anesthetic is pressed over his face. There's a moment, half a breath before his body slumps. Then the surgeon moves fast, really fast, because he has to. In this improvised operating room, speed is everything. The longer it takes, the greater the risk of death, whether from shock infection or blood loss. Limbs are removed in under 10 minutes, sometimes under 5. That's not an exaggeration, it's survival protocol. The saw itself isn't fancy, just a thick curved blade with a wooden grip. But in these hands it becomes something awful and oddly elegant, an instrument of brutal mercy. Flesh parts, bone snaps, and the stump is cauterized or stitched depending on how much time they have. Often not much. A single doctor might perform dozens of these amputations in a day. His coat becomes crusted with blood. His hands never fully clean. Yet he moves with eerie calm, like a butcher who's memorized every angle. Gangrene was the real killer. Once it set in flesh, turning greenish black and reeking of death, there was no going back. That's why amputation wasn't a last resort. It was a first line of defense. Cut the limb, save the life. Still, results varied. Some men recovered. Others slipped away days later, fevered and trembling, their bodies overwhelmed by infection. And historians continue to debate the statistics. Was amputation truly effective, or did it simply feel like control in an uncontrollable war? There's also the question of chloroform. It had just come into widespread use by the time of the Civil War, but supply chains were fragile, and the substance itself was volatile. Some surgeons used too much, causing respiratory failure. Others used too little, and the patient woke up mid-saw. In one battlefield journal, a young medic describes a man who sat up mid-amputation and began reciting a hymn calmly, clearly, as if nothing was wrong. It was the most peaceful horror I ever saw, the medic wrote. But not all operations went so quietly. Often there wasn't enough chloroform, or any. In those cases, whiskey returned not as antiseptic this time, but as anesthesia. Soldiers bit down on leather straps or wooden spoons. Others screamed. Some fainted before the saw touched skin. And a few remarkably held still, jaw-clenched eyes burning with something between courage and resignation. You wonder briefly how anyone slept after assisting with one of these surgeries. Then you realize they probably didn't. They just lay back, hands shaking, and waited for the nightmares to start. Evening settles over the camp, but rest is far off. Somewhere near the mess tent, a quiet buzz begins to rise, not from flies this time, but from talk. There's word of a surgeon experimenting with maggots. Not the kind that accidentally wriggle into rations. No, these were intentional, clean ones, collected from fresh meat, placed delicately into wounds. You edge closer to the tent where it's happening, half curious, half disgusted. Inside, a soldier lies on a cot leg wrapped not in cloth, but gauze beneath which something shifts. A nurse lifts a corner to check. There they are, tiny white bodies wriggling peacefully, munching away at necrotic flesh. It should be horrifying. Somehow it isn't. The idea wasn't completely new. Ancient tribes had used similar techniques. But by the Civil War, it was still deeply strange. Surgeons debated the practice with raised eyebrows. Were the maggots removing dead tissue and leaving healthy skin untouched? Or was this just another wartime delusion? Some physicians swore by them. Others refused to enter a room where they were being used. The most surprising thing, it worked. In many cases, wounds treated with maggots healed faster, stayed cleaner, and avoided infection. Historians point out that maggots naturally secrete enzymes that break down rotting tissue and kill bacteria, a kind of organic scalpel. It earned them nicknames like surgeons with no hands or nurses with teeth. Yet, even with proof, the method stayed fringe. Maybe it was the optics. Hard to convince a soldier he's being helped when his wound looks like it's infested. But those who endured it often credited the maggots with saving their limbs, and in rare cases, their lives. Toothbrushes oddly entered the conversation too, not for teeth, for wounds. Some soldiers used coarse bristle brushes to scrub out infections, a crude method. But when water and soap ran short, a dry brush and a little whiskey seemed better than nothing. The line between hygiene and harm blurred fast. In one bizarre account, a lieutenant insisted his men carry toothbrushes not for dental care, but for scraping mud out of bullet wounds. Better clean pain than quiet rot, he told them. It became a kind of grim motto, and so it went. Maggots gently devouring decayed toothbrushes, scratching away dirt, all in the name of staying one step ahead of death. You watch the nurse secure the gauze again, nodding with calm professionalism. She moves on to the next cot without flinching. There's something poetic in it, isn't there? Insects and tools of vanity repurposed as lifesavers. In the absence of modern medicine, the battlefield bred its own solutions, some elegant, some grotesque. There's no consensus among scholars on how widely these methods were used. Records are inconsistent, sometimes silent, but the stories endure whispered between veterans, scribbled in journals passed down like ghost tales that somehow turned out real. Outside, the fireflies begin to blink. You follow the flicker of lanterns to the riverbank, where steam rises from a paddle wheel hospital ship moored in the muddy shallows. The Mississippi rolls by brown and slow, carrying whispers and waste in equal measure. As you step onto the creaking deck, the air shifts less gunpowder, more mildew, sweat, and something sour that clings to the throat. Inside, narrow corridors funnel you past rows of cots packed shoulder to shoulder. Men groan, mutter, and sweat through fevered sleep. Some stare blankly at the ceiling. Others weep softly not from pain, but memory. The walls are lined with damp sheets meant to absorb infection, but they have absorbed too much. Everything feels soaked in human struggle. These hospital ships were repurposed steamers, once used for moving goods, now loaded with the broken. Medical equipment jostled beside barrels of vinegar, and the pharmacy was usually a box nailed to a wall, filled with what little the quartermaster could spare. The doctors, often volunteers. The nurses, a mix of professionals, nuns, and soldiers, too injured to return to combat. One nurse in particular catches your eye. She moves steadily from bed to bed, adjusting bandages, wiping brows, whispering reassurances like prayers. Her apron is streaked with blood and iodine. Her eyes tired but sharp meet yours for just a moment. Then she turns back to her patient. The smell of infection is everywhere. Gangrene blood and rotting cloth swirl into a pungent fog that seems baked into the ship's timbers. No amount of vinegar wash can lift it. Some nurses tied herbs in cloth and wore them around their necks, partly for superstition, partly for self-preservation. Historians still argue whether these ships helped or harmed. On one hand, they brought wounded men closer to medical care. On the other, the confined quarters made them breeding grounds for disease. One floating hospital reportedly saw more deaths from infection than from the original injuries. Still, the ships kept sailing. Outside, the river reflects moonlight and trembling silver lines. Supplies are hauled up by rope, fresh bandages, clean water, opium tinctures, and sometimes just more hands. Everything aboard is temporary. Nothing stays clean. Nothing stays long. You pause by a soldier whose leg is suspended in a makeshift sling, the flesh beneath his bandage puffy and angry. He asks if you know whether they're docking soon. You don't. The ship rarely stops for long. It's a place of in-between a vessel, not just across water, but between pain and recovery, life and death. Above deck, the nurses take their turn sleeping in shifts. Hammocks swing gently in rhythm with the current. Someone is softly humming a hymn, one of those slow, aching tunes that seems to fold time in half. You lean on the railing, let the breeze cool your face, and realize you're not sure if the humming is for the living or the dead. The river doesn't say. It just keeps moving. The next morning begins not with sunrise, but with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes when pain returns and words don't help. Down the line of cots, men stir reach for something, anything to dull the sharp edge of waking. And for many, that something is opium. A nurse passes you a small wooden tray with tiny corked vials. Some are labeled laudanum, others just marked with numbers or stains. Each one holds a dose of poppy-based relief, thick and bitter, handed out with the familiarity of coffee. Some soldiers call it God's sleep. Others call it forgetting in a bottle. You watch as one man, a boy, really tilts his head back and swallows his share without flinching. His hands stop shaking. His breath evens out. He looks up and half smiles, as if the pain has stepped outside for a smoke. Opium wasn't new in the 1860s, but the Civil War made it common. Surgeons handed it out after amputations for dysentery, for infected wounds, for phantom limb pain. The military even issued it in rations. It worked too well. Because it didn't just relieve pain, it erased it. Softened memories made horrors feel like dreams. And once the war ended, many veterans found they couldn't sleep without it. There's a strange kind of logic in addiction during war. When everything else is out of control, the body craves predictability. A measured drop of opium, a moment of stillness. One more night without screaming. Some doctors were cautious treating opium as a last resort. Others, overwhelmed, undersupplied, relied on it for triage. Better numb than dead, one journal read. But not all agreed. Scholars still debate how aware surgeons were of its long-term effects. Some believe they turned a blind eye. Others suggest they simply didn't know. In a journal found years later, a Confederate medic wrote, "We quiet their suffering, then pray their minds do not return before morning." The opium came in many forms, drops on sugar cubes, pills, smoke, or dissolved into whiskey. One soldier describes a syrupy dream that lasted 2 days, during which he spoke to his mother, his horse, and a tree, all of whom answered. When he woke, his leg was gone, but the pain hadn't returned. He never asked for it back. By the war's end, addiction was rampant. Newspapers called it the soldier's illness. Quiet, shameful, but everywhere. Some men brought bottles home like medals. Others couldn't function without them. And in rural areas where doctors were rare, laudanum was easier to find than fresh bread. You pass a mirror nailed crooked on the wall. Your reflection looks tired, older than yesterday. Behind you, the tray is nearly empty. The nurse scribbles on a small notepad and moves on, humming under her breath. You wonder if she ever takes a dose herself. Then again, she doesn't look like she sleeps. Some wounds, it seems, never fully close. They just get quieter with help. The morning sun is high now, but it brings no warmth inside the medic's station. You follow a soldier limping in his arm, clutched tight against his side, wrapped in something that looks suspiciously like the lining of a saddlebag. The wound isn't fresh, but it's festering, angry, swollen, weeping from the edges. The surgeon peers at it, then reaches for something in a pouch that smells like campfires and old tobacco tins. He's not reaching for a bandage. He's reaching for leaves. Crumbled tobacco pressed into a cloth, then soaked in water, and wrung out into a thick, dark poultice. It goes straight onto the wound. The soldier winces. The surgeon shrugs. It draws out the poison, he mutters, as if repeating something taught long ago without knowing if it's true. You've seen this before, tobacco poultices used like magical salves, sometimes mixed with ash vinegar or even spider webs. It sounds absurd. It kind of is. But in a world where belief fills the gaps left by science, it's what they had. The origin of the practice is murky. Some say it came from folk medicine traditions in the South. Others argue it was borrowed from native remedies altered beyond recognition. There's no scholarly consensus. What is clear, soldiers used what they had. And they had a lot of tobacco. In the absence of antiseptics, the logic went something like this. Tobacco stings, it dries, it smells strong. Surely that must mean it's killing something. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Researchers today suggest that nicotine might have mild antibacterial effects, but not enough to justify stuffing wounds with it. Still, when your choices are tobacco or mud, the leaf seems almost refined. Superstition ruled much of battlefield medicine. Soldiers carried lucky coins, wore red string around their wrists to block the fever, and sometimes avoided certain tents rumored to be cursed. One unit refused to use a particular stretcher because everyone it carried died. No one tested the theory. They just left it leaning against a tree. In some regiments, men believed that bleeding from the left side was survivable, but the right side was fatal. Others swore that certain wounds smelled lucky, a kind of dark poetry born of desperation. It wasn't about truth. It was about comfort. And in war, comfort is currency. You sit near the edge of the tent watching the soldier with the tobacco-wrapped arm sip weak coffee. He doesn't seem convinced, but he's not arguing either. The surgeon pats his shoulder and moves on, pouch still rattling with more leaves, more belief. Outside, the camp continues, boots crunching on gravel, orders shouted, flags flapping. But in here, everything is slower, a quiet dance of hope and habit, of pain and poultices. You wonder how many of these makeshift rituals became lifelong habits carried home in pockets passed to children, told as half-jokes at kitchen tables, and whether decades later, anyone still packed tobacco against a scrape just in case. The surgeon's pouch is worn, its leather darkened by sweat and time. You kneel beside it, curious, and gently pull back the flap. Inside a jumble of tools, some recognizable, others mysterious. A rust-speck scalpel, a chipped glass syringe, a bent spoon. There's a folded saw blade wrapped in cloth, and a pair of scissors that look more suited for trimming hedges than stitching skin. This is a field kit not of a trained physician, but of an amateur surgeon scraping by. On paper, every unit was supposed to have a proper medical officer. In practice, many didn't. Soldiers with steady hands and strong stomachs became surgeons by necessity. Their kits were scavenged, traded, improvised. One soldier might carry tweezers meant for removing bullets, another sewing needles used for uniforms and wounds alike. A bent coin, some swore, could plug a hole until help arrived. You turn over a small bottle empty now, but its label reads, turpentine external use. It was once used to sterilize wounds, clean instruments, even as an emergency antiseptic. Did it work? Historians remain divided. Some argue it merely staved off gangrene temporarily. Others say it worsened the damage. One thing is certain, it burned like fire. The most fascinating tool is a small folding spoon. It was used to measure laudanum, but also served as a makeshift retractor, a suture knot pusher, and when cleaned, something to eat with. In war, everything had to serve multiple roles. A surgeon's kit was like a magician's satchel, mysterious, indispensable, always incomplete. And not everything in the pouch was medical. There's a tiny pencil stub, almost worn to nothing, tucked next to a crumpled paper scrap. A list. 5 names, likely men this surgeon had tried to save. 3 are crossed out. The last 2 still waiting. Some field kits were passed from hand to hand. When one medic died, his tools went to the next brave soul who stepped up. Sometimes the only training came from watching a single operation. Then, it was your turn to hold the knife. There's a legend repeated in many diaries of a Union drummer boy who became his regiment's unofficial surgeon after assisting with 2 amputations. By the end of the war, he was performing procedures himself, using a knife borrowed from the mess tent and forceps made from reshaped tongs. The pouch beside you has a smell leather rust, old tobacco, and something faintly medicinal. You imagine the hands that packed it, hands that shook during their first incision, hands that wiped sweat on a blood-stained sleeve, hands that despite fear kept working. You fold the flap shut. Outside, the wind kicks up dust, and someone shouts for more rags. Inside the tent, the kit waits. It's not clean, it's not complete, but it's all they had, and in the field just enough was often the difference between life and death. And sometimes, between remembering and forgetting. The heat today is unbearable. It clings to your skin like a damp blanket, heavy and sour. You swat at something near your ear, another fly, then another, and another. They're everywhere, buzzing, landing, crawling along the lips of unconscious men. Inside the medic tent, the air hums with their wings. It's not just a nuisance, it's a siege. Rot has a smell, but flies have a sound. Together, they create a soundtrack that won't let you rest. Open wounds, soiled bandages, discarded rags, they're all invitations. Some tents hang strips of sticky tar-soaked fabric to catch the worst of them. Others try smudging fires, hoping the smoke will drive them away. But mostly they just come, in waves, in clouds. One soldier, too weak to swat them, lies with a cloth over his face, not for modesty, for defense. A nurse walks by with a fan made of horsehair and flicks it over his body. It buys him maybe 3 minutes. The smell of rot is more than unpleasant, it's diagnostic. Doctors of the time could tell how deep an infection had spread just by sniffing. Sweet rot meant superficial. Sour rot meant trouble. And then there was the smell of death, thick, greasy, unmistakable. A surgeon once described it as like bacon left too long in the sun. He never ate pork again. Historians continue to debate how much of this olfactory diagnosis was truly accurate or just grim tradition. Still, many medics trusted their noses more than their eyes. The fly problem, however, was less debatable. It was universal. Soldiers nicknamed them black rain field demons and less printable things. One account tells of a tent where the buzzing was so loud, wounded men covered their ears and wept not from pain, but from sheer noise. Another soldier recorded a game he played with his tent mate, counting how many flies he could kill with a single slap. His record was 13. In response, some units created fly guards, men armed with bundles of switchgrass or towels pacing slowly through hospital tents just to wave the insects away. A few surgeons even wore veils like beekeepers, though it made vision difficult. The measures were desperate. They were also mostly futile. Despite everything, some found odd comforts in the buzzing. One soldier wrote in his journal that he preferred the noise because silence meant death. As long as the flies swarmed, there was still something to fight, still something to swat, still something alive. You step outside for air, but the heat follows. The sun glares down on the latrines, the cooking pots, the piles of stained linens waiting to be burned. Everything steams, everything stinks. And above it all, the flies dance tireless, triumphant. You wonder what it must have been like to fall asleep to that sound, to have no silence left except the kind you feared most. By late afternoon, the air thickens with sweat and suspicion. A fevered soldier is being carried into the shade, moaning softly. His face is flushed, his skin damp and hot. The surgeon frowns and reaches for his lancet, a small, sharp blade used for one thing: bloodletting. Yes, even here with bullets flying and gangrene gnawing, some doctors still believe that draining blood could rebalance the body's humors. Illness, after all, was thought to be an excess of something: heat, bile, moisture. And what better way to restore balance than to open a vein? You kneel nearby, watching as a vein is located, pricked, and drained into a tin bowl. The blood is bright at first, then darker. The soldier stirs, then stills. The bowl fills. The doctor stops satisfied. There's no thermometer, no blood pressure cuff, just instinct and theory passed down from Galen and Hippocrates. Historians still argue whether these methods were harmless traditions or harmful delusions. Some believe a little bleeding had placebo value. Others insist it weakened already dying men. In either case, it was practiced well into the war, and sometimes with startling confidence. One surgeon kept a brass scale near his cot and claimed he could diagnose fevers by weighing blood loss. If it's lighter, he said the fever burns brighter. That claim, researchers agree, has no basis in medical fact. But no one stopped him. And bloodletting wasn't the only outdated idea still clinging to life. There was cupping applying heated glass bulbs to the skin to draw blood to the surface. There was mustard plaster for pneumonia, though it often caused burns. Leeches made rare but memorable appearances, especially in field hospitals run by old-school European doctors. You hear a nurse mutter under her breath, "Better to keep the blood in." She moves on quickly, not wanting to challenge protocol in public. Despite the persistence of these practices, reformers were emerging. A few young surgeons fresh from medical schools in New York and Philadelphia questioned the old methods. They carried newer books, favored observation over ritual, and spoke of germs, though the word still sounded foreign in most tents. They were often laughed at, but some soldiers started requesting them by name. There's a recorded case of a captain who refused treatment unless it came from that lad who doesn't drain me like a hog. He survived his wounds. Barely. Still, for every skeptic, there were a dozen traditionalists. And in the chaos of war, most soldiers took what they could get. If the doctor said, "Bleed," you bled. If he said mustard plaster, you braced yourself and waited for the sting. Now the soldier under the tree breathes more evenly. Maybe it helped, maybe it didn't. But he's sleeping, and sometimes that was all the proof anyone needed. You glance at the tin bowl now, half full, dark, and glistening. A fly lands on the rim. You wave it off, but it circles back again, drawn to tradition like iron to a compass. At the far end of camp, near a cluster of dying trees, a group of soldiers huddles around something that looks less like a workshop and more like a junk pile. Fence posts, chair legs, bits of canvas and cord, all of it scattered on the grass. But this is no idle gathering. They're building crutches. One man crouches over a stump, carving notches into a post with a dull knife. Another tests the strength of a rope harness by leaning into it with his full weight. A third sits quietly sanding the splinters off a jagged chair arm that will soon support someone else's shattered leg. No blueprints, no supervision. Just need muscle and ingenuity. Amputation was common, mobility was not. The Army didn't issue recovery gear. If you wanted to walk again, you made it yourself, or relied on the kindness of someone who still could. You watch as a soldier lashes two fence rails together with a strip of boiled leather, then pads the top with a piece of his own bedroll. It's crooked but sturdy, and it works. With effort he stands, wobbles, grins. The others nod satisfied. One slaps him on the back and mutters something about Yankee engineering, though they're all Confederates. There's a kind of silent dignity in these moments. War tears bodies apart, but these men are stitching back their independence one crude invention at a time. Historical records mention a wide array of improvised AIDS wheelchairs made from barrows, slings formed from rifle straps, walking sticks carved from branches that still smelled of sap. Some units became known for their odd recovery contraptions. One regiment even had a competition for who could build the fastest crutch. The winner attached a wheel from a broken cart to his. Was it effective? Not really, but it made people laugh. And laughter in a field hospital was a rare and powerful medicine. Some scholars suggest this culture of self-repair created unexpected bonds, men helping each other walk again before they could even sit up straight. Others argue it was simply necessity made into ritual, a form of control, however small, reclaimed from the chaos. You spot a nurse nearby, stitching a strap onto a canvas sling. She pauses, nods toward a soldier who's just finished crafting a support frame for his bunkmate. That one's made 4 of those this week, she says. says it keeps his hands busy. She doesn't add keeps the nightmares out. But you understand. One journal recounts a Union soldier who carved an intricate cane from a peach tree limb he'd found during retreat. He etched every battle he survived into the wood, one knot for each. When he died, the cane was passed to another wounded man who added his own marks. You stand there silent as a makeshift crutch is handed off like a medal. No ceremony, no applause, just survival traded from one hand to the next. And somehow, it holds. The humidity thickens again this time, carrying something new, a faint sweetness that clings to your nose and then turns sour. A medic stumbles past you with a tin cup and a tightly wrapped packet quinine, bitter, chalky, essential. Inside the camp, someone is burning old blankets in a barrel. Fever has returned. Malaria was an invisible enemy, but a relentless one. It crept into bones, curled into joints, and rattled teeth with chills. In the swamps and humid fields of the South, it was as common as coughing and nearly as deadly. And quinine extracted from the bark of cinchona trees was the only thing standing in its way. You follow the medic to a small line of men, each holding out their hand or cup. He scoops bitter powder into their water, or sometimes their whiskey. They grimace and swallow. No ceremony, no thanks, just routine. Some soldiers called it bark dust. Others called it gut bleach. Supplies were scarce. By mid-war, quinine was so difficult to obtain that soldiers stole it, traded for it, or diluted what little they had. Some licked the bottom of tins for the bitter grit left behind. Others mixed it with molasses or honey just to make it tolerable. One diary mentions a soldier who learned to swallow it without tasting by thinking of his mother's peach pie. Historians debate just how effective these rations were. Some claim they cut fever rates significantly in well-supplied units. Others argue that rationing made it nearly useless. Many men simply went without. And when the fever came, it came hard. Teeth chattered, skin burned. Visions visited of home, of people long dead, of landscapes that twisted and turned like dreams written on melting wax. Soldiers scribbled letters in the dark, then forgot they had written them. One man reportedly spoke perfect French for an hour before falling unconscious, though he'd never studied the language. You sit beside a soldier who's shaking violently. His blanket is soaked, his pupils unfocused. A nurse steadies his head and places a cool rag on his brow. "Still with us?" she asks gently. He nods. Barely. There was a ritual to surviving malaria. Ride the fever, sweat it out, drink what you could, and pray the next round didn't kill you. In some camps, a soldier's odds depended on whether he bunked near stagnant water or uphill from the latrines. Geography became medicine. Quinine shortages became political. Doctors wrote desperate letters to supply officers. Some experimented with local plants hoping to mimic the effects. Bark from oaks, roots from wildflowers. None worked well, but desperation breeds hope in strange forms. You glance at the medic's pouch. Only a few doses left. He mutters something about sharing with the worst cases first. And maybe if the next shipment arrives, he won't have to choose. Above you, the clouds churn. Somewhere in the woods, a mosquito hums its quiet war cry. It starts with a search, not for bandages or quinine this time, but for something more precious, disinfectant. The surgeon paces the edge of camp with a glass bottle, tipping it upside down as if hoping for one last drop. Nothing. The label has long faded, but it once read carbolic acid. Now it's just a ghost of a remedy. Inside the medic tent, a boy with a jagged arm wound lies moaning. His gash is deep, dirty, and raw. The nurse washes it with warm water and lye soap better than nothing, but far from sterile. She glances at the empty bottle on the table, then at the surgeon, who only shrugs. Disinfectants were a revelation when they could be found. Lister's theories on antiseptic surgery had just begun circulating by the 1860s, but few American field surgeons had the luxury of reading journals between amputations. Those who did and believed them had another problem: supply lines. Carbolic acid was rare, expensive, and dangerous to transport. It was volatile, prone to spilling or spoiling. So, when a shipment made it through, it was rationed like gold. Used sparingly, guarded, fought over. One surgeon wrote that he would rather trade a horse than a bottle, so they improvised. You watch as a medic mixes vinegar and whiskey in a tin basin. The smell is sharp familiar. He dips gauze into it, wrings it out, and applies it to a wound. It sizzles slightly against the skin. The soldier winces. That's the sting of hope, someone mutters. Some used iodine when they had it, though it often ran out faster than morphine. Others turned to boiled salt water. A few even tried crushed garlic, believing the old tales of its cleansing power. One creative soul reportedly brewed pine sap and ash, calling it forest antiseptic. It mostly just turned the wounds green. There was no agreement on what worked. Scholars still argue about the relative merits of these stand-ins. Were they effective? Possibly. Were they better than nothing? Almost certainly. But none came close to true sterilization. One surgeon, desperate after a battle near Vicksburg, used gunpowder paste on open cuts. The logic: if it burned, it must be clean. The result: mixed at best. One man lived, two didn't. The experiment wasn't repeated. You step into a tent where the smell of turpentine hangs like fog. It's being used to clean instruments between operations barely cooled from their last use. You see a saw glinting in the half-light, dripping with something too thick to be water. A nurse wipes it down with rags soaked in spirits. They're reused, rewashed, re-soaked. Everything cycles until it falls apart. Even the term disinfectant feels too modern. To many in the camp, it's not about killing germs, they don't know the term yet. It's about smell, sting, and superstition. If it bites the nose, it must be working. You leave the tent and exhale into the damp evening. The wind carries the scent of vinegar and pine. You hope for their sake, that's enough. The scream cuts through dusk like a knife. Not the drawn-out wail of slow pain, but the sharp, short cry of sudden fire. You rush toward it instinctively, and as you duck under the tent, flap, the glow hits you. Not from lanterns, but from a bayonet heated red-hot over open flame. A soldier grips a comrade's shoulders as the glowing blade is lowered to his thigh. The wound is deep, and it's bleeding fast. Stitching won't hold. There's no chloroform left. Just this searing metal, and the hope it will stop the flow. Cauterization was one of the oldest tools in a battlefield medic's arsenal. Brutal, yes, but effective. Heat sealed arteries when nothing else could. And when a limb gushed too much too quickly, glowing steel could mean the difference between a survivor and a casualty. The bayonet hisses as it meets flesh. The wounded man thrashes once, then stills. Smoke curls from his skin like incense from a temple. The smell burnt meat, blood, and leather turns your stomach. Was it worth it? Some historians argue that cauterization caused more tissue damage than it prevented. Others believe it saved thousands who would have otherwise bled out. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle. The practice was risky. It often led to infection. But when time ran out and tools failed, fire remained. Soldiers adapted quickly. Bayonets were the most common cauterizing tools, not because they were ideal, but because they were always nearby. Some units heated iron tent stakes or even flattened spoons. The shape didn't matter. The heat did. One tale tells of a surgeon who used a branding iron from a nearby farm. He apologized before applying it. The soldier nodded. "Just keep me alive long enough to see the river again," he said. He did. Some soldiers begged for cauterization, even when it wasn't recommended, believing fire could burn the sickness out. Others resisted until the last moment, knowing the pain would be unlike anything else. One Confederate officer famous for his calm under pressure reportedly fainted before the metal even touched his skin. A nurse near you dips a cloth into vinegar and presses it to the patient's brow. He breathes heavily, but does not cry out again. The bleeding has stopped. The wound smokes slightly, and the surgeon, his hands shaking only now, lowers the bayonet into a pail of cold water with a hiss. There's no applause, no moment of reflection. The next wounded man is brought forward. You step back into the night air, heart thudding, stomach uneasy. Somewhere nearby, someone is sharpening a blade. Someone else is stoking another fire. And you wonder how many more glowing bayonets tonight will write that thin line between survival and silence. The camp sleeps in fits and starts. But the fires, those stay lit. A pile of cloth catches your eye near the campfire, except it's not rags for cleaning rifles or bedding. It's bandages, stained, wrinkled, and knotted. Someone is sorting them, pulling apart the least bloody ones, soaking others in buckets of brownish water, laying the driest on nearby stones to bleach under the moon. There are no fresh rolls, no sterile packaging. These are yesterday's dressings, pressed back into service by necessity. Bandage shortages were constant, especially in remote or overrun units. Medical teams were often forced to scavenge cutting up shirts, trousers, even curtains ripped from commandeered homes. Linen was prized. It was soft, absorbent, and easier to wash. But even that ran out. So they boiled what they had and used it again. And again. And again. A nurse beside you unknots a soaked strip with practiced fingers. She winces slightly. It smells of old blood and lye. Still, she folds it carefully and sets it aside. She'll use it again before dawn. Soldiers knew this rhythm. Bleed, bandage, reuse, bleed again. Some kept their own cloths tucked in their bedrolls, stitched with initials or lucky charms. Bring it back, they'd say, when handing it to the nurse. Most of the time, it didn't come back. Historians disagree on how dangerous this practice truly was. Some argue it caused more infections than it prevented. Others point out that boiling, drying, and vinegar rinses likely killed many pathogens, at least enough to reduce risk. But without consistent sanitation, every reused rag was a gamble. There's a story half true, half folklore of a sergeant who labeled his personal bandages with small charcoal marks so he could identify them later. He believed that reusing his own blood was safer than wearing another man's. The medical staff humored him. He survived 3 wounds and refused fresh linens until the war's end. In another account, a makeshift hospital ran entirely out of cloth during a siege. They resorted to using corn husks wrapped in tobacco leaves. It worked for about an hour until the husks split and the wounds reopened. That night, the unit burned their only tent to boil one last batch of rags. You look around now and see the system at work. A triangle of care, one person washing, one drying, one re-rolling. It's quiet, efficient, almost ritualistic, and strangely intimate. These aren't just supplies, they're lifelines. Carriers of pain and healing reused like whispered prayers. A boy no older than 16 limps over with a fresh cut on his hand. A nurse reaches into the pile and selects the least offensive bandage. He doesn't flinch. He just watches the knot being tied like he's done this 100 times. The cloth darkens quickly. Tomorrow it will be unknotted, boiled, dried, folded, and used again. By someone else. For something else. But, for now, it holds. And in this war, anything that holds even for a night is worth saving. The camp is quieter now, as if exhaustion has finally seeped into the ground. But in a corner near the mess tent, lantern light still flickers. A wounded man leans over another, checking the bandage on a thigh wound with surprising care. His own arm is in a sling. His shirt is stained, but his hands steady, deliberate move like someone who's done this before. That's because he has. This is how it ends in many units, not with doctors, but with soldiers turned medics. When the real surgeons were killed, reassigned, or simply overwhelmed, others stepped in. Men who had been patients last week became caretakers this week. Their training, being treated. Their tools, whatever was left. You crouch nearby and watch as he splints a leg using 2 planks scavenged from a crate of hardtack. The binding is tight clean. He glances up and gives a small nod, then moves on to check the next patient. No ceremony, just work. Historians have documented dozens of cases like this. Former artillerymen performing amputations, cavalrymen stitching wounds. One soldier, after surviving a chest wound, began carrying extra bandages just in case someone else fell. He eventually led his unit's aid station. These men weren't just improvising. They were building systems. Some units developed rosters of wounded, who could still walk, talk, and lift, essentially drafting them into rotation as medical staff. And over time, these soldier doctors gained reputations. He knows how to set a break, someone would say. Or, she cleaned my wound better than the surgeon. Yes, she. In rare but documented cases, women disguised as men to enlist were revealed after being wounded and stayed on as nurses or medical aides. One such soldier reportedly performed 3 amputations in a single night after her identity was discovered. No one argued. Was this sustainable? Not really. But it was survival. Some scholars argue that this fluid movement between patient and healer blurred the lines of battlefield hierarchy. Others suggest it created a kind of bond not even shared in combat, one forged not in attack, but in aftermath. You see a man writing something in the dirt with a stick names, maybe, or inventory, or just a way to stay sane. Behind him, another folds a bloodied uniform into a pillow for a boy with cracked ribs. These are acts of quiet resilience, the kind history often forgets. One soldier famously stitched a fellow private's side, shut using thread unraveled from a sock. He kept the needle tucked in his boot for emergencies. The man he saved lived to write about it. He called him Dr. Sock. The wind shifts, and with it the groan of a cart being pulled toward the fire pit. Used rags, shattered splints, and empty bottles clink together like wind chimes from another world. The man with the sling is still moving, checking pulses, dabbing foreheads, repositioning feet. You realize he doesn't know if the war is ending. He just knows someone has to help until it does. And sometimes the best doctors were the ones who learned on the job, because they had no other choice. Just beyond that flickering firelight, another kind of survivor's ritual unfolds, one involving teeth laughter and a biscuit hard enough to spark a mutiny. You've barely crossed the line into camp when the smell of overboiled coffee and something else, something faintly dusty, greets your nose. The something, as it turns out, is hardtack. You pick one up, and it thuds like stone in your palm. Flat pale and pocked with air holes, it resembles a cracker forged in a kiln. The Army calls it a biscuit, though no self-respecting baker would claim it. This was the staple ration of both Union and Confederate forces, a pre-war naval invention that survived storms, warehouses, and presidential administrations. Made of just flour and water, hardtack could be baked months, sometimes years, before ever reaching a soldier's tin plate. And reach it did in barrels stacked high like coffins of carbohydrate. You nibble, it doesn't give. Soldiers had their tricks, soaking it in coffee, frying it in pork fat, even smashing it with rifle butts to break it into edible shards. And still, it fought back. One Pennsylvania infantryman wrote home that his hardtack was so old, it bore the signature of King George. Whether or not that's true remains a mystery, but it's one of many exaggerations in the biscuit's bizarre legacy. There's a funny kind of bonding and shared misery, and this biscuit bonded whole companies together. Men named it tooth dullers, worm castles, and less poetically edible masonry. Entire songs were penned in its honor, or maybe as therapy. One popular camp ditty included the line, "'Twas hardtack I ate for my wedding night feast, and I chipped half my smile on the starter." But even this sorry ration has defenders among historians. Some suggest hardtack was nutritionally sound for its weight, while others debate its actual age on arrival, were soldiers eating 2-year-old biscuits, or just overly judgmental about fresh ones. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the cracks. By moonlight, a lone soldier might use a pocket knife to carve his name into one as though daring time to forget he ever existed. And sometimes during long marches they'd sling them from strings like medals worn more for mockery than nutrition. Still, if you were lucky, your hardtack was merely hard. The unlucky ones got weevils, tiny determined beetles that drilled homes into the flour brick like they owned the place. Shaking the biscuit out before eating became standard practice, less for sanitation than the hope of removing extra protein. Tonight you feel that slow crunch beneath your teeth softened by imagination. You're surrounded by men lying on wool blankets, each nursing the same unchewable mistake. It was food, barely. But it was shared, and that made it bearable. The sky shifts from indigo to a murky gray drizzle as you trudge into the supply tent, where barrels glisten faintly with brine. A soldier hauls one open with a grunt, and the smell hits first. Salt pork. Thick pink slabs clinging together like unwilling dance partners at a country ball dunked in years of salted water. Pickle beef swims nearby, limp and graying. You learn quickly not to expect freshness. The meat has no expiration date because it never had a beginning worth celebrating. These rations were preserved in salt so heavily they could likely survive a second civil war. Salt pork, when cooked, releases a cloud of grease that clings to clothing, eyelashes, and possibly your soul. And yet, to the weary troops, this was dinner. The Confederacy's version often fared worse. Less access to robust supply lines meant more spoiling, more scavenging, and more days spent cursing empty tins. Union soldiers didn't always fare much better. One soldier described his ration as a salted memory of what might once have been meat. Still, every now and then you'd find a piece that wasn't green. Some units got creative, slicing the pork thin and frying it into crispy curls. Others buried it in stews or baked it into cornmeal to hide the flavor. But most days, it was a chore. Soldiers even created meat lotteries, drawing lots to see who got the least offensive piece. Losers were easy to spot, green around the gills and clutching their stomachs after dinner. There are stories told in exhausted whispers of barrels left too long in the sun. When opened, they belched gases that sent entire squads running. One unlucky group once tried to cook from such a batch and promptly buried the meat with full military honors. Whether or not this actually happened or simply became a popular campfire fable remains uncertain. Surviving records do show courts-martial involving dishonest quartermasters. Some historians argue that officers occasionally skimmed the better cuts for themselves, leaving troops with what might have qualified as inedible evidence. Others claim it was just the luck of timing, arriving after a long supply chain turned pork into pickled sponge. And yet, for all its faults, this meat provided the protein backbone of Civil War nutrition. Soldiers needed fat salt and calories to march and fight. Salt pork and pickled beef, however offensive to modern palates, delivered those in spades. The trick was convincing your mouth to cooperate. You watch as a soldier gently scrapes the green edge off a slice, shrugs, and tosses it into a skillet anyway. There's no disgust left, just the quiet resignation of hunger. Someone else pours river water over a canteen lid to wash it down, already bracing for the next bite. It wasn't good, it wasn't fresh, but it was theirs. And sometimes when the meat didn't glow, that counted as a win. You know it's morning in camp, not by the sun, but by the scent. Thin, bitter, and oddly comforting, it's coffee, or something like it. You trail behind a soldier cradling a blackened tin cup, its handle bent from heat and habit. He crouches near a smoldering pile of ash stirs with a stick and mutters, "Strong enough to float a bullet, he's only half joking." The Civil War ran on caffeine. Both Union and Confederate troops prized their daily brew with religious fervor. When the beans ran out, as they often did in the South, substitutes were devised: parched acorns, roasted rye, even scorched peanuts. None matched the real thing. Some were so vile they earned nicknames like "Sloosh of Regret" or "Bitter by Design." But soldiers drank them anyway. Warm liquid was warm liquid. Union soldiers, supplied by a more stable economy and better logistics, clung to their government-issued beans with the desperation of true believers. Roasted and packed in large sacks, the beans traveled hundreds of miles to be boiled over open fires. Men ground them with rocks, smashed them with rifle butts, or even chewed them raw if time was short. And when all else failed, they just dropped whole beans into boiling water and hoped. Coffee wasn't just about caffeine, it was rebellion, routine, and ritual. Soldiers would sneak extra beans from quartermasters, hoard them in socks, or trade them for tobacco with Confederates across enemy lines. One recorded incident describes a temporary ceasefire during which Union and Confederate troops shouted across a creek, swapping beans for Southern-grown cigars. Historians still debate whether these events were common or rare, but the accounts are too consistent to dismiss entirely. Campfires became coffee houses in disguise. One soldier scribbled in his diary, "We discussed politics, philosophy, and the relative merits of squirrel stew all over brew, so bitter it made us feel alive." Another wrote that the only reliable thing in war was death discomfort and the blessed smell of burnt beans. There were, however, rules. You never wasted a cup. Even the dregs could be reboiled, reused, or filtered through a sock, preferably clean. And on rough days, a few soldiers spiked their brew with a splash of whiskey, claiming it cured dysentery. Some scholars argue that this practice did more to hurt morale than help, but others suggest it kept men calm and steady. You crouch by a group huddled under a tree, steam curling from their battered cups. One man offers you a sip. It's awful but warm. His smile says, "It's all we've got." You nod, drink, and let the silence settle. For a moment, the war disappears into the rising steam. This wasn't just a drink. It was dignity in liquid form. A way to claim control even when the world reeked of salt pork and smoke. Coffee reminded soldiers that they were still human, however roughly brewed that humanity might be. And in the quiet between cannon fire, it was the only warmth they trusted. There's a softness in the air today, not in the weather, but in the mood. A rare whiff of something sweet drifts from a small iron skillet where a soldier stirs a thick golden batter over low flame. No, it's not cake, not really, but it's trying its best. It's cornmeal molasses and a few questionable dreams. And tonight, it's dessert. You crouch beside the cook, who's humming tunelessly and watching the mixture bubble like it's a sleeping child. He scraped this batch together from a tin of stolen syrup, a cup of cornmeal swiped from a forgotten barrel, and a generous helping of hope. The cakes sputter gently in the pan, holding their shape just long enough to flip. There's no butter, no eggs, no luxury, just the illusion of sweetness in a war-sour world. Molasses was a rare treasure in most Civil War camps, especially on the Confederate side. When it appeared, it was doled out like medicine, thick, dark, and slightly smoky. Soldiers stretched it with river water, or stale beer, mixing it with flour cornmeal, or even crushed hardtack to make rough cakes. Union troops had a slightly easier time acquiring it, though even they considered it a luxury. When the syrup ran out, they turned to sorghum, which offered a more bitter alternative. Despite the conditions, soldiers got creative. They used empty cans as baking tins, tin plates as griddles, and occasionally the flat side of a shovel, if nothing else was clean. One man wrote in a letter home that he learned more about baking in camp than he ever did at home. Another bragged that his molasses corn cakes could fool a city man into thinking he had found a bakery. The results were mixed. Some batches burned into blackened pucks, others turned to goo, but the effort counted. These cakes weren't just food, they were marole wrapped in golden crust. Eating them felt like a holiday. Even if the molasses came from a dubious source, say, an accidentally unlocked officer's supply crate, no one asked too many questions. Historians still debate whether these makeshift sweets were widespread or isolated strokes of culinary luck. Some diaries mention them fondly, others not at all, but when they did appear, they became legends. One Union regiment reportedly held an unofficial cake day after a particularly generous shipment. Another tale speaks of a Confederate camp, where a cook fashioned a birthday cake using burnt molasses, crushed nuts, and wild mint, earning himself a cheer from 20 starving men. You take a bite. It's sticky, grainy, and oddly satisfying. The molasses clings to your fingers like honey. Around you, the mood has lifted jokes, fly boots tap, and someone dares a short tune on a battered fiddle. The war hasn't ended, but for a moment, it's paused. These weren't just cakes. They were memories in the making, brittle warm and gone too soon. A hush settles over the camp as dusk paints the sky in bruised purples and fading oranges. A pair of soldiers slip through the brush boots soft on pine needles, hearts pounding just a touch faster than usual. They're not on patrol. They're on a different kind of mission, one where the goal isn't glory, but grub. You follow them quietly, ducking low beneath branches and stepping wide over snapped twigs. They're foraging, behind enemy lines. It's not quite desertion, not if they return before dawn. But it's not sanctioned either. This is the gray zone of hunger, and desperation makes for good climbers. They find a fence. Beyond it, a tidy garden, half wild, with weeds, rows of beans, and early squash still hanging under moonlight. They whisper. One man shimmies over lands with a grunt and begins gathering with the reverence of a churchgoer collecting hymns. No lantern, no noise. Just dirt under fingernails and urgency in every movement. Foraging was an open secret during the Civil War. Both sides did it. Union troops in the South slipped away to raid unattended farms, and Confederates wandered into abandoned towns or friendly backyards hoping for a hen or a handful of corn. Commanders officially forbade it, but when rations failed, discipline blurred. Some officers even turned a blind eye, especially if the men shared their haul. You reach the edge of a barn, inside 2 eggs in a dusty nest, a half-full sack of oats, and a mouse glaring like it owns the deed. Your companions grab what they can and vanish into the night. It's not much, but it's something. Tomorrow's breakfast might actually crunch for the right reasons. There are stories always told in hushed tones of men who foraged too long and never returned, either caught by the enemy or claimed by night itself. Yet more often they returned with onions, apples, or wild greens. Some were caught and punished extra duties docked rations, a firm lecture from a weary sergeant, but rarely anything more. Everyone understood that hunger didn't follow the chain of command. Scholars remain divided on how widespread this practice was. Some claim foraging was a lifeline for entire regiments. Others believe it was more myth than method glorified in letters home. The truth likely lies somewhere between a quiet nightly ritual for those who dared. One Southern soldier described in his journal how a nighttime forage yielded 2 pumpkins and a scrawny rooster. He and his friends roasted the bird over a fire, made from fence posts they weren't supposed to touch. It tasted like ash and triumph, he wrote. Back in camp, the loot is passed around like sacred relics. The eggs disappear into a bubbling tin cup, scrambled with pinches of wild herbs and bits of yesterday's pork. You're handed a spoonful. It's warm, oily, and perfect. Foraging wasn't just survival, it was defiance. A whispered no to hunger, to scarcity, to war's cold efficiency. And in the middle of it all, it reminded soldiers they could still choose if only for one stolen bite. You wake to the clink of metal against metal, sharp and irregular, like makeshift music. A soldier is crouched nearby, balancing his bayonet across two rocks, using it as a spit. On its tip, something pale and wrinkled sizzles half-heartedly. He looks up and shrugs. Better than nothing. You nod. This is breakfast Civil War style. Without proper cookware, soldiers turned to whatever they had on hand. Bayonets became skewers. Helmet lids transformed into frying pans. Even flat stones, if heated long enough, did the job. It wasn't about culinary excellence. It was about getting anything warm into your belly. You move toward a group gathered around a small fire, where a dented canteen half full of rainwater sits perched on a rock. Someone drops a lump of cornmeal into it, another adds chopped pork. A forked stick stirs the mixture, while a third man fans the flames with a tattered letter from home. The meal, swamp grits, they joke. And everyone laughs, kind of. The creativity bordered on the absurd. One regiment famously used the concave surface of a drum to fry bacon. Another tried roasting corn in musket barrels, an experiment that ended with more noise than nutrition. Still, soldiers improvised. Helmets weren't just for bullets. A man could steam a biscuit under his cap while marching, so long as he didn't mind the sweat seasoning. Accounts vary on how effective these methods were. Some claim bayonets cooked meat evenly if slowly, while others describe frequent disasters, burnt rations, broken tools, and melted tin plates. Historians still debate whether these cooking methods were innovative adaptations or desperate stopgaps. Letters and diaries often include both praise and ridicule in the same breath. One Union soldier detailed his helmet hash recipe in a letter: pork scraps, stale bread, and wild onions fried in a helmet over an open flame. His only complaint? The metallic aftertaste. Another wrote about balancing a potato on his rifle barrel and twirling it slowly like a spit until it fell into the fire and caused a brief smoky panic. There were casualties too, not just in battle, but in breakfast. Overturned lids, collapsing rock stoves, and even scorched eyebrows from flame flares were common. Yet, despite the burns and blunders, these meals brought comfort. Food, no matter how strange the method, became ritual. You lean back as someone passes a sliver of charred something on a knife tip. You bite. It's chewy, salty, and almost good. Someone else hums a tune, something about marching and molasses. The sun creeps higher, and with it the scent of improvisation and pride. Cooking in camp wasn't just about nourishment. It was identity, agency, and memory. The meals were often failures, but they were yours, cooked with your gear, your hands, your grit. And in that strange way, war allows even burnt bacon on a bayonet felt like a win. A soft drizzle begins to fall, dappling the surface of the stream that snakes past camp. A soldier stands at its edge, tin cup in hand, watching the current with wary eyes. He crouches, dips the cup, and pauses. This isn't thirst, it's calculation. The next soup depends on what the river gives, or doesn't. Canteen soup, they called it, though the name was generous. Imagine a greasy puddle of water dotted with scraps of meat, crumbled biscuit, or a lonely bean all bobbing together like survivors of a culinary shipwreck. It wasn't always appetizing, but it was hot, and in war that counted. Soldiers used their canteen cups for everything: boiling, frying, brewing, even brushing teeth. When water was scarce or dirty, they boiled it with salt pork fat to mask the taste. The results varied: sometimes a savory broth, sometimes a disaster that left the cup fused to the firestone. Union camps better supplied could sometimes offer actual soup with beef bones, potatoes, or even dried peas. Confederate camps, less so. Many relied on dried turnip leaves, worm-eaten beans, or borrowed onions from gardens that may or may not have belonged to the cook. Every pot told a different story, and yet canteen soup became a staple. It was infinitely customizable, if not infinitely edible. One soldier swore by adding hardtack crumbs to thicken his. Another claimed the trick was letting the pork fat simmer for exactly 7 minutes, long enough to make it dance, not drown. Some even used wild garlic or sassafras leaves for flavor, though success was debatable. But the water, always. The water was the wild card. Rivers weren't clean. Wells went dry. Rain barrels filled with leaves, insects, and mystery. Dysentery became so common, it was almost expected. Soldiers strained water through handkerchief shirts or even socks, praying that heat would kill whatever was lurking inside. Historians disagree on how effective these makeshift filtration methods were. Some diaries suggest boiling did little to stop illness. Others praise it as a lifesaver. No two regiments agreed. The science of sanitation hadn't caught up to the battlefield. What they did know was simple bad water could end a man faster than bullets. One Confederate diary describes a pot of mud stew, a rain-filled hole boiled with moss bark and squirrel bits. The writer claimed it tasted like courage, or desperation, possibly both. Another soldier recalled watching a horse upstream and realizing too late that the water he'd just scooped was probably flavored by something other than rain. You sit now by a small fire, holding a cup of something vaguely brown. It smells salty like overcooked dreams and peppery hope. You sip, and it's not the worst thing you've had. It's warm and it settles your stomach, even if it raises some questions about your immune system. Canteen soup wasn't a recipe. It was a survival tactic, a warm placeholder between hunger and despair. In every mouthful, you could taste both invention and surrender. Night has fallen like a blanket, heavy and quiet. Across the line, the enemy is no more than a murmur. Campfires flicker like distant stars, each one glowing with the quiet routine of another soldier doing exactly what you are trying to eat. But tonight something unusual is brewing, literally. A Union soldier walks carefully to the edge of a trench, carrying a small bundle under his coat. He waits. Across the field, a faint whistle answers 2 notes sharp and fast. He kneels, places the bundle a packet of coffee beans on a flat rock, then retreats silently. Minutes later, he returns to find the beans gone. In their place, a twist of dried tobacco still warm from someone's pocket. These trades weren't official. They weren't frequent, but they happened small exchanges between supposed enemies who, despite politics and gunpowder, still craved the same simple things: flavor, comfort, and the feeling that not everything had been lost. Ration swaps across enemy lines remain one of the Civil War's more curious mysteries. Accounts exist in letters and diaries, sometimes couched in coded language. Coffee for tobacco, soap for buttons, an apple for a sweet potato. These deals didn't change the war, but they changed the night, if only for an hour. Some historians argue these were isolated incidents, exaggerated by veterans later, for the sake of drama or peaceable nostalgia. Others insist they were part of a broader unspoken understanding among soldiers that humanity could survive even in the mud between gunfire. There is no consensus, only quiet evidence passed from soldier to soldier in memory. You move through the camp and hear whispers of a successful swap. Someone got a jar of molasses for a Union patch. Another traded a pocket knife for a small wheel of cheese. No one asks how. No one reports it. In fact, the unspoken rule is simple. If it brings warmth, it stays secret. One letter tells of a soldier who swore he met his enemy twin during such a trade. Same age, same farm background. even the same favorite stew. They shared a laugh, shook hands, and vanished back into their separate sides. That soldier would never fire his rifle again. Not out of protest, just heartbreak. Not every swap went smoothly. Some ended in gunfire confusion or missed signals. There were tales of traps set under the guise of barter, though most were likely rumors passed along to discourage fraternization. Still, every swap carried risk. A misplaced step, a misunderstood signal, and the whole trench could erupt. Tonight, though, you watch a young man warm his hands around a cup of coffee he didn't have yesterday. He sips eyes closed, breathing in peace that tastes slightly smoky. Somewhere not far off, another soldier lights his pipe, exhaling the same breath from a different side. In that fragile quiet between battles, food became language. And for those brief whispered moments, the war paused so that a sip could become a truce. The tent flap rustles as you duck inside, drawn by the faint clatter of a spoon against tin. Inside, a soldier sits cross-legged, poking suspiciously at his plate. Whatever he cooked seems to be moving, or at least that's what he claims. You look closer. It's not the food. It's what came with it. Beetles. Again. Mealtime in Civil War camps wasn't just a battle against hunger. It was a war against pests. Rats scurried under floorboards. Ants invaded sugar tins like tiny regiments. Weevils curled inside hardtack, unbothered by the insult of being baked alive. No ration was safe. Nothing stayed unspoiled for long. You sit across from a man who's taken to tapping his bread before eating, hoping the vibrations shake out whatever might be nesting inside. Others develop techniques brushing food with pine branches, soaking it in river water, or even charring the outside to crisp off any crawling passengers. These were half measures, but they helped. Mostly. Pest control wasn't just inconvenient, it was demoralizing. Imagine being starving, then discovering your only biscuit comes with protein you didn't ask for. Some soldiers would simply eat around the bugs. Others claimed they added texture. One private proudly declared he never ate alone. There was always a weevil or two for company. Historians agree that sanitation in camps was at best ambitious and at worst non-existent. Slop pits overflowed, trash piled up, and latrines were often dug far too close to the kitchens, if kitchens is the right word for a circle of rocks in a pot. The lines between vermin and neighbor blurred fast. There were attempts to fight back. Soldiers trapped rats with makeshift snares, string tin, and a little salted pork. Ants were smoked out with burning wood or kerosene, but nothing ever stayed fixed. The pests always returned. One Union camp kept an informal scoreboard of rats caught each week, morbid entertainment in a grim setting. And then there were the horror stories, rats chewing through sleeping bags, ants swarming open wounds, or cockroaches found inside coffee cups. Some of these are likely exaggerations passed around like ghost stories to new recruits, but others appear too frequently to dismiss. A few officers ordered regular burnings of infested food stores. Others simply instructed men to eat fast and don't look. A Confederate journal records a cook who labeled one pot stew and another stew no visible bugs. The latter always ran out first. Scholars still discuss how much pest exposure contributed to illness. Some argue it was a major vector for disease. Others suggest that most men simply built immunity by necessity. Whatever the truth, mealtime became a gamble. Would you find food or find it already occupied? Back in the tent, the soldier shrugs and takes a bite. He's long past the point of flinching. Adds crunch, he mutters with a grin. You try your own portion. It's not bad, and it's warm. In this war, that's half the victory. And so, surrounded by chirps, squeaks, and tiny feet, dinner proceeds quietly, cautiously, and always with a second glance. A hush settles over the camp as moonlight glints off the brass buttons of an officer's supply tent. A low murmur drifts between bedrolls someone's planning a raid. Not on the enemy, but on their own. The Target A crate of canned peaches sealed tight under regulation, guarded by rank and privilege. For the enlisted men, it might as well be treasure. Stealing from officers' stores wasn't exactly endorsed, but it was far from rare. When hunger gnawed and the official rations turned to mold or mystery, soldiers got creative. A sleepy guard, a poorly tied flap, or a loud distraction on the other side of camp opportunity came in many forms. And when it did, you acted fast and left no footprints. You follow two soldiers now creeping like cats through the shadows. They know the route. They've timed the patrol. One slips under the canvas, while the other keeps watch, heart pounding so hard it could light a lantern. Moments later, a sack is passed out inside. Tins clink like guilty coins. The hall. 1 jar of preserved cherries, 3 hardtack biscuits that hadn't yet crumbled to dust, and a small tin of butter. Real butter. For a moment they look at it like it's gold. Then, without a word, they vanish back into the dark. Such raids weren't always about food. Sometimes it was coffee candles, even a scrap of tobacco or sugar. Anything that made life feel less gray. Some soldiers wrote of these missions with pride, others with shame. Many pretended they never happened, but they did and often. Historians are divided on how common these thefts were. Some suggest it was an open secret tolerated so long as discipline wasn't publicly broken. Others believe it was rare and punished harshly when discovered. Surviving court records offer little clarity, though many memoirs hint that the line between discipline and turning a blind eye was thinner than a bayonet edge. One private recounted in a letter that he once stole an entire ham from an officer's quarters, cooked it in secret, and invited 6 men to dinner. "We dined like kings beneath the stars," he wrote, and paid, with 3 days of latrine duty. Not a bad trade, he added. There was risk, of course. Some were caught and sentenced to extra labor or public shaming. One Union camp reportedly made guilty men wear signs reading, "I stole from the hand that fed me." Still, the raids continued. Hunger has always outranked shame. Tonight, back in your tent, you see the stolen butter melting into cornmeal cakes the cherries passed around like communion. No one says a word, but every man there feels the same thing, joy laced with guilt. Or maybe it's the other way around. In a war of orders and obedience, theft became its own kind of freedom, a bite-sized rebellion smuggled under moonlight. Morning breaks with a haze of wood smoke and simmering debate. Near the campfire, 2 soldiers crouch over a skillet, bickering in hushed tones. One insists his mother fried corn dodgers in lard. The other swears it's bacon grease or nothing. You sit down beside them, caught in the quiet drama of culinary tradition. Corn dodgers, those humble fried patties of cornmeal, were a staple on both sides of the Civil War. Compact filling and adaptable, they traveled well, and filled stomachs better than hardtack ever could. But how to make them? That's where things got heated. In the Union camps, corn dodgers were often flattened into discs, fried until crisp on the edges, and eaten hot off the pan. In the South, some soldiers preferred them, rounded almost dumpling-like, with a soft center and a golden shell. Additions varied by region: molasses, wild herbs, bits of pork, or even honey when they were lucky. Today's argument centers around texture. If you can bounce it, it's not a dodger, it's a weapon. One soldier mutters, flipping his with theatrical flair. The other retorts, "Better that than a corn pancake." You watch amused as the debate continues, equal parts culinary and cultural. This divide wasn't just a campfire quarrel. Soldiers wrote letters home, asking for recipes, praising one version over the other, and poking fun at their rivals' cooking habits. Corn dodgers became an edible extension of regional identity: North versus South, skillet versus spoon, crisp versus tender. There's no scholarly consensus on the origins of the corn dodger. Some trace it back to Native American fry breads, others to Appalachian cooking traditions. Diaries and cookbooks of the era offer conflicting instructions. What's certain is that no two camps prepared them the same way, and every soldier believed his version was best. A Union lieutenant once wrote, "If the South fried their politics like they fry their Dodgers, we might have avoided this whole mess." It was a joke, but also a nod to how even food became a metaphor for division. And yet, in a strange way, it also united them each side, perfecting the same dish with different seasoning. You take a bite of one now, golden, a little greasy, and surprisingly fluffy. The outside crunches the inside, yields. Not bad, not bad at all. Another soldier tries one and nods in approval, though he still grumbles that it would have been better with bacon fat. Nearby, someone from another company approaches with his own batch. A spontaneous taste-off begins. They swap bites, grumble in mock horror, and joke that the enemy should try these instead of bullets. For a moment, war pauses for a cook-off. Corn Dodgers weren't just food. They were pride, comfort, and contest rolled into one. Whether crisp or soft, fried in lard or grease, they carried the weight of home in every bite. And as the sun climbs higher, the argument fades, but the smell of victory seasoned with salt and smoke lingers just a little longer. The sun slips lower as you wander beyond the main tents where the woods begin to reclaim the land. The air is damp, rich with the scent of moss and leaf rot. A soldier crouches near a patch of low greenery, plucking something with deliberate care. Dandelion leaves it, turns out today's salad course. Not every Civil War meal came from barrels and forage barns. Sometimes soldiers turned to the wilds for greens roots and anything that didn't wriggle too much. Dandelions were a favorite bitter sure, but packed with whatever passed for vitamins. Mixed with wild onions, clover, or chickweed, they became field salads nibbled raw or tossed into stews. You join the gathering crew watching as they point out edibles like seasoned herbalists. A root here, a leaf there. One man insists the purple flowers ward off fever. Another's chewing something he calls tooth powder bark. You're not sure it's safe, but he seems confident and still conscious. The line between food and medicine blurred in these quiet patches of wilderness. Soldiers harvested sassafras, roots for tea, chewed birch bark for headaches, and carried wild mint to freshen the stale taste of old rations. Knowledge passed between regiments like gossip, what cured cramps, what might kill you, what worked on dysentery if prayed over first. Historians note the influence of enslaved peoples and Native Americans in spreading this plant knowledge through southern camps. Confederate troops cut off from major supply chains, especially leaned on folk remedies and edible plants to stretch their diets. Union troops, while better supplied, also adopted these habits in times of scarcity or illness. Surviving letters reference everything from boiled thistle tea to fried cattail stalks. Some soldiers swore by them. Others avoided them altogether, scarred by bitter experiments gone wrong. One wrote home about a stew so green, it looked back at me. Whether it was dandelion or something more adventurous remains unknown. There's still scholarly debate about the actual nutritional value of these foraged additions. Some researchers argue they offered crucial vitamins that preserved health. Others believe they were mostly symbolic, something to chew when your stomach rebelled against hardtack and grease. Still, the ritual of gathering was its own form of sanity. Today's haul is modest, a handful of dandelion greens, 3 fuzzy wild onions, and something resembling a carrot if you squint hard enough. Back in camp, these go into a dented pot with water and salt. The result, a vaguely herbal broth that smells better than it tastes. You sip slowly, it's grassy, earthy, and oddly soothing. It won't fill you up, but it reminds you that the land still gives even in wartime. Around the fire, others do the same quiet spoons, thoughtful faces, and the faint hope that tomorrow's forage might yield a mushroom or two. In the silence that follows, the rustle of leaves becomes music. Not every meal needs meat. Sometimes a handful of weeds is enough. Smoke drifts low over the camp, clinging to wool jackets and damp canvas. A soldier stirs a blackened pot, and you swear it smells like leather. Not in the metaphorical sense, real leather, boiled, thick strips of belt or bootlace bubble slowly in murky water. Desperation has many flavors. Tonight's is tannin. Welcome to the edge of starvation, where boiled boots are no longer a joke, but a last resort. It wasn't common, but it happened. Soldiers cut soles into strips scraped off the grime and simmered them for hours, hoping to soften the unyielding hide into something remotely chewable. What they got was not a meal, but maybe a memory of one. You sit beside the cook, who explains with a grin too wide to be sane that heel leather softens better than toe. He adds salt, then laughs because there is no salt. The only seasoning is smoke and sarcasm. Boiled boots were more than a rumor. Eyewitness accounts exist from both sides of the Civil War. Some scholars dismiss these as exaggerations, morale letters designed to win sympathy from loved ones. Others point to corroborating stories, especially during sieges or winter encampments when supply lines collapsed. Petersburg, Vicksburg, and parts of Georgia saw soldiers reduced to eating roots, rodents, and, yes, occasionally their own shoes. One Union diary describes a man gnawing on his cartridge pouch like jerky. A Confederate letter details the process of boiling a belt for 7 hours before attempting to eat it, only to give up and use it as insulation instead. The line between nourishment and madness wore thin in those moments. And yet, there's a grim ingenuity here. Leather, after all, is animal hide. In theory, it contains calories. In practice, it contains mostly regret. Soldiers tried boiling it with onions, molasses, even mint if they had it. One described the resulting stew as like chewing on grief flavored with bark. You take a tentative sip of the broth. It's bitter, gritty, and carries the vague flavor of wet barn. No one pretends it's food. But they drink it anyway because it's warm and because there's nothing else. Hunger turns imagination into necessity. Historians debate how widespread the practice was. Some argue that stories of boiled boots were symbolic, a way to illustrate suffering rather than document it. Others believe it happened more often than records suggest, hidden by shame or forgotten in the flood of other atrocities. Whatever the truth, the symbolism lingers. To eat your boots is to declare you've reached the end of options, the bottom of the barrel, the soul of your soul. And still somehow it becomes a moment of shared resilience. Around the fire, someone jokes that tomorrow they'll try buttons next. Another offers up his hat. Laughter echoes thin but real. Even in the bleakest meal, soldiers found flavor in each other. And in that laughter, you taste the one thing that didn't run out: defiance. The war doesn't end with a cannon blast. It fades slowly like smoke from a dying fire. One day the rifles quiet, the shouting dulls, and someone says, "We're done." And just like that, soldiers find themselves preparing not for battle, but for a feast. You step into a clearing where tables makeshift boards on crates and barrels stretch beneath fluttering scraps of white cloth. A victory feast, or at least an imitation of one. There's no silverware, no crystal goblets, but there's stew, cornbread, something that might be apple pie, and more laughter than you've heard in weeks. Ceasefire picnics weren't standard issue, but when they happened, they were unforgettable. Some were spontaneous troops discovering the armistice together and pooling rations into one communal pot. Others were semi-formal affairs arranged when the smoke cleared long enough for humanity to peek through. Bread was broken, songs were sung, and for a brief moment enemies dined like neighbors. One of the most famous examples occurred at Appomattox. After Lee's surrender, Union officers reportedly offered rations to starving Confederate troops: bacon, cornmeal, coffee. General Grant instructed his men to avoid all exultation. There would be no gloating, only dignity. Scholars continue to debate whether that moment was truly solemn or somewhat staged for history's sake, but most agree the food was real and the hunger mutual. Elsewhere, ceasefire meals happened under quieter circumstances. Two regiments might hear rumors of peace meet cautiously in a field and exchange goods instead of bullets. Hardtack was swapped for Corn Dodgers tobacco for dried apples. Fires were lit not to signal attack, but to warm stew pots and fingers. One soldier recalled a ceasefire meal shared with a group from the opposing side. They sat in a ring passing a flask of peach liquor and eating from the same pot of beans. We spoke no politics, he wrote, only farming and the taste of real salt. Another remembered a shared fire with boys in gray, where songs traded hands faster than spoons. You wander now from table to table. A young man stirs a pot of rabbit stew. Another slices boiled sweet potatoes, arranging them like coins. There's music just a harmonica, but it feels like a full band. Someone's dog darts underfoot, chasing crumbs and compliments. The food isn't fancy, but it feels abundant. The flavor is in the company. A man to your left claps a stranger on the back. He's from the other side. Neither seems to care anymore. Historians love these stories. They represent the rare shining pauses in a dark chapter. Some argue these moments were exaggerated post-war, crafted to smooth the jagged narrative. Others believe they were all too real and far more common than recorded. After all, peace is quieter than war. It doesn't leave as many notes behind. Still tonight in this flickering twilight, the feast is real. Every bite tastes like breath, like memory, like survival. And across every plate lies the same quiet message: we made it. Smoke curls from the last campfire as a soldier stoops over a pot, his ladle moving in slow practiced circles. You watch from a distance not him, but the hands. Calloused, steady, ungloved despite the cold. He's not a fighter, he's a cook. And tonight finally someone remembers to thank him. The forgotten cooks of the Civil War weren't generals or flag bearers. They wore no medals delivered, no stirring speeches. Yet they held the army together, one ladle at a time. Most were enlisted men assigned to kitchen duty. Some volunteered. A few were hired civilians. And many, especially in Confederate camps, were enslaved men and women whose labor was recorded only in hunger and silence. Their days began before dawn and ended long after the last mess tin was scraped clean. They hauled water-chopped firewood, stirred vats of stew so large they needed paddles. They managed dwindling supplies with an alchemy that turned scraps into sustenance. If they were lucky, someone tossed them a nod at the end of a meal. You edge closer as the soldier stirs a pot of beans laced with pork fat, his rhythm steady. Another cook dumps in dried apple slices, turning supper into something almost festive. Around them, soldiers drift in like moths to heat. These cooks know their names, their habits, who likes more salt, who can't chew hardtack, who always asks for seconds, but pretends it's their first helping. Some camps had professional cooks, often immigrants who brought techniques from Germany, Ireland, or Italy. Others relied on whoever drew the short straw. Confederate field kitchens sometimes depended entirely on enslaved labor. These cooks prepared not just food, but entire meals for officers and their guests, often without acknowledgement or thanks. Historians have only begun to recover their stories. A few names survive. One Union regiment remembered Old Sam, who could stretch a tin of beans to feed 20. Another honored a woman known only as Aunt Liza, who cooked in muddy skirts and fed both wounded men and the healthy with equal care. She never carried a weapon, but her stew reportedly saved more lives than bullets ever could. Despite their critical role, camp cooks rarely appear in military records. They were background noise in the grand opera of war. Some soldiers mocked them, Others praise them in diaries, often with warmth and gratitude, especially when a cook turned coffee into comfort or found a way to fry a stolen egg just right. You sip from your tin. Tonight's stew is simple: salt beans, wild greens. But it tastes like ceremony. Around you, the cook is telling a joke. A small group laughs. Someone calls him Sarge, though he holds no rank. He waves a ladle like a scepter king of the kitchen. They were the unsung tacticians of taste, these men and women. They couldn't stop bullets, but they softened war's bite one meal at a time. And in every spoonful they left behind a warmth that outlasted the coldest night. The fire has burned low now, its glow fading into soft amber beneath the stars. The clatter of tin cups and murmurs of tired voices have quieted, replaced by the slow rhythm of breath and the occasional creak of boots beside bedrolls. All around the camp settles into stillness. Tonight, you walked the long mess lines of history through bitter coffee-battered rations, stolen sweetness, and the stubborn dignity of boiling a boot for broth. You followed foragers through moonlit fields, watched bayonets turned into skillets, and saw how even enemies could swap tobacco for beans under a silent truce. Through it all, there was humor invention and the steady hands of cooks who stitched meals from scraps and memory. It wasn't a glamorous war, but inside every meal, however crude or crawling, there was comfort, a quiet refusal to let hardship have the last word. So rest now. Let the echo of sizzling cornbread and creaking ration crates lull you to sleep. Somewhere in the dark, a cook still stirs his pot, humming a tune only the beans understand. And tomorrow, perhaps there will be coffee, maybe even real coffee. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?